I'm up here in Union County, Georgia to tell you the story of a fascinating man, a reverend, an early pioneer of this county, who was killed in a dispute over moonshine. Now, apparently, this story has been turned into a bit of folklore, and a lot of the real facts of the case have been distorted by history. And I'm going to link you to a book now that was written by descendants of Reverend John Henry Lance. In either case, what the folklore says is that John's father, Sam Lance, was an early pioneer who came to this part of Georgia back when it was not a part of the state. You see, according to Code Duello, if you get into a duel with someone and are too sick to carry out the duel and you refuse to go, that is dishonor. However, you can get around this if you call on a friend or a close family member to go and do the duel for you. I haven't read how Samuel Lance fared in that duel, but he did survive, and he brought his son John down. And John liked the local area and became a reverend ministering to the local community. However, because he was very anti-moonshine, he built up a large hate around him. And this is something that followed him all throughout his time as a reverend in the community, and he had to move very regularly from Union County, Georgia to Clay County, North Carolina. And eventually, and this is apparently where the story differs from the facts of the case, he was killed by a man named Fred Cainip, and this was in a dispute over moonshine, because he was preaching, why are you all moralistic, except for when it comes to moonshine and gambling, and this actually got quite a few holy people and preachers killed making statements like this. And he is buried up here in an early pioneer cemetery right next to his wife. And if you see on the wife's grave, she had 10 children, which is kind of just a hallmark of being an early pioneer. And no doubt many of them are buried under these stones, these field stones over here. Beautiful mountain scenery. And over here you have the grave of even an early pioneer who was involved in the Mexican Wars. He came back and died in 1848. That would be Andrew M. Hunter, 2nd Lieutenant. If you take the off-road from the intersection of US 129 and Georgia 180, about 5 minutes south of Reverend John Henry Lance's grave, you'll come across this sign marking Suches. And about 150 feet down in this ravine is the actual place where the Reverend was murdered, according to folklore by Fred Cainip, but apparently, according to the family, by another man. This is the type of area you'll find around where a lot of these moonshine murders and bootleg killings were committed in the 1920s and 30s here in Georgia. It's nice, gentle, rolling hills just north of Atlanta, which also gave birth, of course, to NASCAR. As people fled Prohibition agents, they would have to navigate the back roads. And, of course, nowadays, it's kind of all been built up. But I mean, you've still got plenty of areas out here. This is kind of a rich community of people that mostly live and work in Atlanta, but have property up here. But back in the day, you can see people driving through these hills on their brand new Model Ts, evading federal authorities. And to continue our early 1900s true crime tour of Georgia, this is the grave of Prohibition agent William Daniel Dorsey, shot and killed while searching a farmer's property for a moonshine still on June 13th, 1920, less than a week before his birthday. His wife continued, living on and dying in 1964. And all across Georgia you can find the graves of these Prohibition agents and moonshiners who died in shootouts with each other. Here in rural North Georgia, people really liked Agent Dorsey and they called him Little Bill. But when he was out searching John Farmer's residence and found that moonshine still, John actually opened fire and managed to kill Dorsey, but in the process he wounded his partner Ed Carpenter, and Carpenter wounded the moonshiner, taking him in and charging him with murder later in that year. What better place to begin my true crime tour of West Georgia than at the Hulsey family plot at Rose Hill Cemetery in Rockmont. In the back here we have the grave of Fred Hulsey Sr., who was executed alongside his father Bill Hulsey in 1932, the only father-son execution the state of Georgia has ever held. And this execution happened because of a triple murder that took place on the Hulsey farm near Van Wert in 1930. Apparently Fred and Bill had invited 3 men named Cliff Jones, Lige Harper, and Ernest McCullough to their farm in order to play a little poker match. Well, these 3 men had been given a pretty poor deck of cards But they pulled through and they won an outrageous sum of money, and one of the two Halseys pulled out a gun and methodically shot all three of them in the back of the head. The two Halseys were very quickly arrested and taken into the local Polk County jail, where they kept quiet about details concerning the murders, hoping no doubt that a jury of their peers would refuse to sentence a father and son to die only minutes apart, when it was obvious that only one of them had pulled the trigger. However, as the date for execution rapidly approached and the governor did not have any sign of reprieve, Fred Halsey decided to attempt suicide, and he did this the night before. Guards found him and wired the governor asking what to do, and the governor said unless his injuries proved fatal, proceed with the execution. So the following morning, Fred Halsey was led into the execution chamber, and when he saw the electric chair, he handed over 60 cents from his pocket, requesting that it go to his 3-year-old daughter, Hope. And he told the people who had assembled that he was the one who fired the shots, and his father had only helped him dispose of the bodies. However, this didn't win reprieve for his father, Bill Halsey, who was executed only minutes later. Both bodies were turned over to Bill Halsey's wife, and she had her son Fred buried here in the family plot, and her husband Bill buried in the adjacent Aragon City Cemetery without a grave. And a few years ago, Fred Halsey Sr.'s grandson, Brad Halsey, decided to write a book called 60 Cents, Secrets and Tales in a Small Town, detailing in part the murder of 1930 and the father-son execution of 32. And one more sad chapter to Fred Halsey Sr.'s life is that he tried having several children, and his daughter Marion died after less than a year in 1927, and his son, William R. Halsey, died after less than a year, 1 year previous to that, and his 60 cents was left to Hope Halsey, his daughter, who was only 3 years old at the time, and luckily she grew to be an old woman, dying only in 2001. We're in the small town of Esom Hill, Georgia. Many murders have happened here, a dusty back roads about 100 yards away from the border with Alabama. This goes all the way back to the days of bootlegging, when in 1931, Special Agent James Tillman Moyer was shot and killed here. Local moonshine production was usually on a county line, so if a sheriff came to arrest them, they could just hop the line and have a good head start. Plus, local law enforcement were often okay with this kind of production so long as they were friends with the moonshiners. That all changed with federal enforcement of the law, but this jurisdictional conflict also attracted train robbers. Agent Moyer was investigating robberies from the railroad here when he confronted two men in town. He shouted "hands up," but was shot in the abdomen and died 3 days later. He was with the railroad police, not federal, but still the jurisdictional issue is what resulted in his death. And you can still see this railroad that he was investigating, the Seaboard Air Line Railroad.